And welcome. We are live on the Nonprofit Problem Solver podcast. This is episode 45, and we're going to be talking about volunteering and getting the best out of your volunteer program. But before we do that, let me just say thank you to my sponsors, YachtMe, this virtual platform that we're recording on. If you want to watch the replay, you can vote it at yacht.me, and also to PodPro Audio, making professional podcasting easy. So, Dana, how are you?
I'm good, Kev. How are you this morning?
Good. Love to see you. Well, for me, it's the afternoon, obviously, because I'm in the UK. But so you've got, I don't know, like an 8-hour time difference. So we're on opposite ends of the caffeine mountain, the caffeine curve.
I'm coming up the mountain. You're just coming on the other side.
Right. Yeah, I've already
it's
moved
8
on to
a.m. my
water.
time. Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, you and I know each other. I know a little bit about your background. You were on the panel in the first season of Nonprofit Problem Solver because of your expertise in volunteering. So I'm really looking forward to tapping that over the next 45 minutes or so. But can you give just a quick summary of your nonprofit experience and what got you into volunteering?
Sure. I've been doing volunteer engagement, been a leader of volunteers for coming up on 20 years. And I got my start with Project Open Hand entry level as a volunteer coordinator in 2002-ish, and found that I really loved this. I'd always done some sort of work with people and project management and relationships and kind of producing events and running volunteer programs, designing programs, doing community engagement, volunteer engagement, really kind of blends all of my skills together and all my interests together. And I've been a consultant since 2006, and I've worked with a number of government agencies, nonprofit agencies, corporations over the years, kind of on all ends of volunteer engagement, whether that's nonprofit and designing a program from the ground up, or coming in and doing some updates or adjustments to a 50-year-old docent program at a zoo, or the corporate side of employee volunteer engagement. And I have a special interest in the technology around volunteer engagement, not just volunteer management software, but how can we use technology to kind of, continue to work smarter and not harder when we're doing relationship building in the community.
Right. Well, that'd be interesting to touch on as we
Yeah.
dive into the topic. But just a couple things first. How can people find you online, and what sort of programs or offerings have you got going at the moment? Anything that you'd like to promote or share?
Sure. I'm at danalitwin.com or danalitwinconsulting.com. A quick search engine of your choice, Google, Ask Jeeves, whatever you happen to be using, will find me online. I also have a YouTube channel called Dana's Priceless Advice with leaders of volunteers, where I offer my own Tuesday Tips short video segments every week, kind of on topics like this. And I also post longer interviews with other leaders or up and coming voices in the field of volunteer engagement, community engagement. And this is a really great day to talk to you, Kev, because it's a very busy day. I'm also doing an appearance at our major conference for the sector, the Points of Light conference, this afternoon. So it's a hybrid conference where I'm still in this room, and I've got some pre-recorded material, and then I'll mix that with some live interaction and Q&A in that. So it's a pretty good Wednesday from where I'm sitting.
Well, I'm glad you're taking the time to speak to us. But it's interesting. There's the Points of Light conference. There's the initials after your name, CVA.
Yes.
There is a whole professional side to volunteering that lots of people in nonprofits, even very seasoned professionals in nonprofits, are not that familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about the history of that? Has that been rapidly growing in the last few years, or has it just been like that, sort of invisible to those of us who aren't in volunteering day in, day out?
It's been getting better, particularly the last 5 years, because of technology. And dare I say it, the only silver lining to 2020 being very 2020 about everything was that we had to adapt and use technological platforms like you and I are doing now. And that actually raised the awareness that there are leaders of volunteers who are professionals, whether they're paid or unpaid, running volunteer programs. That's a professional track as much as nurse and astronaut and podcast producer and any other kind of, nonprofit or government consultant. And CVA stands for Certified in Volunteer Administration, and that's actually the only global professional certification that exists. There's lots of great, weekend workshops and paper certificates that you can get doing some classes and courses. But what's unique about the CVA, and you can go to cvacert.org to get more information if you're leading volunteers, but it's not a class you take. It's testing your knowledge and experience and your judgment using all of that as a professional leading volunteer. So it's a very intensive test and candidate process. You have to be recommended. You have to have a certain amount of experience. And it doesn't have the highest pass rate. It's actually a very, very difficult certification to get. Yeah. So I think that the awareness has gone up, but in general, there's been some invisibility or just not quite understanding that it takes resources and investment, and there's a very real return on investment that you can calculate when you're using someone with a CVA or who has real experience managing volunteer programs or creating programs. That's something to really look for in a hire for any nonprofit or corporate social responsibility program or government agency. And that point is being made more and more often. And I'm involved with a couple of organizations that are helping to kind of raise that awareness and do that advocacy with corporate leaders, nonprofit leaders, government leaders, as well as funders, that this is volunteer engagement and resources is really a cornerstone of success for any community service mission.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as you know, I was very grateful for your contributions to the panel from season 1, which was not programs and services. It was on the human resources side. Yep. And this is, to me, one of the most straightforward, obvious, I'm going to say, mistakes that we make in nonprofits is to associate volunteering with programs as opposed to HR.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit about that sort of fundamental misconception about where volunteers and that resource fits into an organization?
Sure. I think of volunteering and HR, they're related. They're two sides of the same coin, which is just good people management and relationship building. So it's more about a transformational process than a transactional process when either of those are successful. And I think volunteerism or using volunteer services to build the capacity of your organization is really the inverse of HR, because in HR, you are having perhaps dozens or hundreds these days of candidates to fill one job. You're screening a lot of people out to get just the one right person for that role. Mm-hmm. Volunteering is the opposite. You want to design your volunteer roles so that as many people as possible from as wide of backgrounds as possible can all do that job, whether that's something that is drop in and do it for a few hours one time with a community group, a faith group, a corporate group, that's a task that could be trained that day, all the way to very, very high skilled things. So there are groups like NTech, Tech for Good, Code for America that are almost entirely volunteer run, very high skilled, doing website design and programming and code and databases for nonprofits. And they still want to have as many volunteers in that talent pool as possible, even when it's very specifically skilled. So really, you can flip the hourglass either way and get, an HR result. But with volunteerism, you want to open up the possibilities of how many different kinds of people can possibly do that task or that role as a volunteer.
So what brings them, what sort of brings it under the HR umbrella or the human or, people development umbrella, mm-hmm. whichever, we've used different terms, is really about, recruitment and supporting them and that all that element organizationally. But the key difference is, rather than recruiting and selecting a single candidate for a job from a pool, you want to create as big a pool as possible. So that's a critical difference.
It's a critical difference, but it's still related. And there are a lot of professionals who have a SHRM, an HR professional certification, or
Hmm.
a CFRE, a fundraiser certification, along with their CVA. And so those are, some pretty serious alphabet soup chops that person has to be able to
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
cross all of those worlds. And there's structurally within an organization, especially in nonprofits, it's always really interesting where volunteer services fits, because it's often a department of one. It's often one person. Even on the CSR and the corporate social side, there's often a tiny,
Hmm.
tiny, tiny department running a foundation side of a corporation or employee engagement side versus, thousands and thousands of people. The other connection to HR is that leaders of volunteers, people who are doing this work professionally, usually have the most headcount of anyone else, and
Yeah,
they are
of course.
and
Yeah.
and they are rarely at the executive leadership table. So that's something else that myself and many other colleagues and organizations are working to change, is that if the person who's running the most people, part-time and full-time, in your organization, whether they're paid or unpaid, isn't in major strategic decisions, it isn't at that table, that's going to be a big disconnect in the ability of your organization to fulfill your mission and serve the community. So really having a seat at the leadership table, being recognized as the professionals that we are, whether there's letters after our name or not, of
Right,
amount of
right.
experience, is really important. But within an organization, sometimes it's like an add-on module, which doesn't really work. Other times it's held under human resources, so the director of human resources might also wear the hat of volunteer services. Depending on the mission of the organization, it can also be within an education department, within development or fundraising department, events, marketing, public affairs, external affairs. So the fact that so many organizations aren't even sure where to put volunteer services on their org chart is can be a really big challenge to recognizing the professionalism of the people in the sector.
Yeah, I can see that. So I initially asked that around programs, but you're right. It is true. It can be in lots of different areas. Is there a right or best place for it, or do you are you more pragmatic about advising people about where they should situate their leadership for volunteers?
It's pretty pragmatic, and it depends on the type of organization and the size of the organization. There's so many community service agencies that are entirely volunteer run. And so
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
case, you're like, well, it's everybody. The board is volunteers, all of the staff that are doing the day-to-day work are volunteers. But it just needs a strategic thought. It just needs to be very deliberate. And that's something that I'm always working towards, is helping organizations realize that volunteer services should be woven through every other master plan, strategic plan that the agency is doing, because it's really the key to community engagement. The most engaged someone can be is volunteering, and volunteers, as any director of development knows, are 10 times more likely to also give money in addition to
Hmm.
their time. So there's a lot of reasons why um, it really should be looked at, and not just a department of one kind of smushed on to a larger organization.
Yeah, and that points to me, I think, the second misconception. And I'm starting with these misconceptions so that we can, just sort of
Straighten them
tee up
out.
these secrets you're going to share.
Yes.
So one is, where in the organization. The other, I think, and I think it was you said this to me, and I've never forgotten the mantra though, and I'm going to now stumble over the words.
Do your
But I think
best, Kev.
you were the one who said to me that volunteers are not a job category; it's a pay grade.
Right.
And so it's a pay grade of zero, but still, and just as the conversation we've just been having,
Mhm.
it's very easy for people to conceive of volunteers as somehow lesser than or second status compared to the paid employees. Almost as though the paid employees are an upgrade to a volunteer role, and so on. And really, from an HR and a legalistic employment law perspective, there's really no difference between a volunteer and a paid person. I think certainly in a lot of jurisdictions.
Mhm.
But it's also just this misconception about the value they bring to the organization.
Absolutely. And that's just a common misunderstanding or misconception that volunteers are free. Volunteers aren't free, even if it's an entirely volunteer run organization. So, yes, um,
Volunteers are free. Yeah,
volunteers, yeah, but that's a common and incorrect assumption that especially, executive directors or general managers or board members or funders make, is like, oh, we don't actually have to put any research into this or hire professionals to design our programs or do community or volunteer engagement, because it's just something that is free and kind of exists and happens. And another kind of joke in the industry is we get asked to provide volunteers as if they're sitting in a refrigerator just in the back room. Like, you just go
right,
like, oh, we
right.
need 20 people to cater waiter the gala tomorrow. And like, let me just go to the freezer. They're going to thaw out overnight. They're going to have all the skills we need. We don't have to train them. We're just going to boop.
Right, right.
Like, and it really takes investment. It takes resourcing. It takes investment. And I just actually did this calculation for a client here in California, but for this agency, which is a zoo, for every dollar that they were spending on volunteer services, they were getting a genuine return on investment of $8.39. And very few other investments in programs or capacity for your organization is going to pay off quite that well. And that's just one sample of their numbers and their programs on, medium big scale, older organization, kind of updating their systems. And these are the same kinds of numbers that you use in any financial services report for the
Yeah,
rest of your
yeah,
organization. And just because volunteer is a pay category and a legal employment status category, most, like to your point earlier, most of the same laws apply. So labor laws apply to volunteers, harassment and equity laws apply to volunteers, and they apply differently. Volunteers are usually exempt from having to be mandated reporters like a school teacher or someone else, but if they're working in a school, they're still background checked or tested for TB and trained to work with kids and families and following certain policies. So I think just this idea that, yeah, sometimes if you have just a quick one-off event, yeah, of course you can have a group drop in at the last minute and do everything just fine. But
right.
for your work and your mission, the best investment that you can make as an executive director or a board chair is in the volunteer engagement process, and understanding that it's all a real thing, and it's a science and art and a craft and a profession.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's overlap with with the costs of volunteer acquisition, and
Mm-hmm.
there is the cost of donor acquisition, just like in the for-profit sector, the cost of customer acquisition. And interestingly, just to use the statistic you quoted earlier, and I think I might have read 10 times um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that the volunteers are 10 times more likely to convert to
Donors.
financial
Yep.
donors as opposed to just time donors.
Right.
So if you're acquiring a volunteer, you're also very likely acquiring a donor.
Yes.
There's a lot of overlap there, but I don't even know if I've never seen calculated anywhere the cost of volunteer acquisition or the cost of volunteer retention, or those sorts of statistics that we commonly see with donors.
There are calculators online for that. And that's what I do for a lot of my clients, quite frankly, is help them calculate if they're starting a program from scratch, which I've done quite a lot. It's like when you're hiring, a volunteer coordinator or manager of volunteer services, or however big the department is about to be that we're creating, and the programs and activities and engagement plan we're creating, this is what the investment up front needs to be. And this is how it's probably with the models and whatever kind of mission or work that agency is doing and however many other employees they have. But that's a very real calculation. And there's some great calculators by Sterling Volunteers. Independent Sector is another organization that actually every year publishes what's the average value of volunteer time per hour. That's one way to do the metric. It's a very common way to do the metric, but you really want to think about volunteer engagement it's really a very interconnected and holistic thing. So if you have, and I have a graph of this that I use in my webinars and workshops, it's going to pop up later today at Points of Light. But you think of, you have an image of a person, and it's like a fan or a beautiful peacock tail of very many feathers. And these are all the roles that one person can occupy at the same time or for a few moments and move in between. So they can be a volunteer, a donor, a board member, a client of the agency they're working for. That was true with Project Open Hand. A lot of clients getting food and grocery meal service were also volunteers. And they can just be a casual fan that likes things and shares stuff on social media. And maybe they never, do a moment of work in their life, but they're helping promote the brand by just like, oh, I like these little videos and memes and tweets that this organization is putting out. And down the line, they're advocates, they're voters. They are people who might have children who get engaged with the mission of environment or social justice or whatever your agency is working towards, that then grow up to be the executive director. So there's this whole kind of sustainability and legacy in looking at this holistic model of one person isn't just the V word, volunteer.
Right.
There's a lot of roles that they can play and a lot of ways that they can interact and engage with and support the work of the agency from near or far.
So would you say, if we segue into the secrets,
speaking of perfect segues,
yeah, would you say that one of them is recognizing the investment required to get the result you're after with your volunteers?
That's absolutely one of them. And I think it's a secret that I don't want to be a secret anymore. That again, volunteers aren't free. It takes investment, it takes resources, and it's going to absolutely pay for itself and pay off. If someone, because sometimes leaders of agencies are very analytical in their approach, and that works for their role as an executive director or a COO, and they just want to see numbers and metrics. Other times, someone is a more transformational leader, or they're leading through relationship building and funder building and community relationships, and they kind of want that anecdote or that feel-good story, utilizing volunteers to support the work of the agency. And it's really a balance of those two things. You're recognizing that there are very significant value adds to properly engaging volunteers and really engaging the community, because it's not about, we're an agency and we're going to go among the community and cherry pick the people that we want, and they're going to all look the same and they're all going to look like us. And like, that's the opposite of how our world is working or should work. So we want to open up how many different kinds of people, a variety of people can do a singular, can be a docent. Can 50 different people take the Tuesday docent shift at the Getty Museum? Yes, it's not just a certain kind of person from a certain age group or a certain background, or that has the time and the wealth to go through all the hoops to be a docent or to become a volunteer. Because the other thing that a lot of leaderships in leadership groups or organizations don't realize is that there's a very real cost to being a volunteer, and there are several barriers to becoming a volunteer. So taking away those barriers is really the biggest secret to success, is understanding what those are, understanding how people feel welcomed or not welcomed into your organization culturally, and just making sure that it's a very easy procedure, and that everyone that a volunteer could ever interact with, any other volunteers, staff members, vendors, that they've all at least got a basic idea of how the organization's volunteer programs or onboarding works, that everyone should be able to have that elevator pitch speech, that 30-second pitch of, here's our mission and here's how you can support it as a volunteer, as a donor, as an advocate. Every single person in the agency should have that messaging, really simple messaging training, so that my other favorite catchphrase, which you may or may not remember from season 1, comes into play. Our greatest hits. We're playing our greatest hits today, Kev.
Yeah.
So my next favorite catchphrase is, every interaction with a volunteer is an invitation to stay or an invitation to go. And that's fine to fire volunteers or dismiss them or not invite them to participate. This isn't just take any warm body. We're not pulling people out of the freezer and thawing them out. We do want it to be a good fit for the mission and the role in the agency. And if somebody is calling an agency trying to volunteer and they keep getting a phone tree or put on hold, or someone cranky answers the phone because they're late for lunch and their blood sugar is low, or they're just not having a good day and they get snapped at, they're not coming back. And they're
Right,
telling their
right.
friends, and that's going through, and that bad experience is spreading throughout the rest of the community. So again, if everyone can kind of have at least a 30-second elevator pitch, basic information about the agency's mission and how to support it, that does huge wonders for helping that overall community volunteer donor advocate engagement.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to distinguish. There are two secrets there.
Yes.
One is recognizing the costs and barriers to actually being a volunteer.
Yep.
So if you were going to design a volunteer role or series of roles that as many people can do as possible to make them as accessible and open as possible, you have to match that on the other side with addressing any access issues you've got to those potential volunteers. So you have to think that thing. And the second is the more general one around the volunteer experience from first contact with the organization all the way through to evolving to a mega volunteer or a donor,
Yeah.
or member staff or what have you. So I've got three now. I'm just going to summarize. I know these aren't in necessarily particular order. You might want to assign some importance to them, but the first one, recognizing that volunteers aren't free and be clear about what the investment is at the front end in terms of acquiring and then managing. Second is understanding the costs and barriers to being a volunteer. Third is mapping out and understanding the volunteer experience. I think we actually had a fourth one where you started with when we were talking about HR, which is instead of designing, I'd say, a job description which identifies this perfect person who's going to fulfill that role in its, if not in its entirely, then win out amongst other candidates going for that role. We want to design volunteer positions so that as many people as possible can do them. I think that's a pretty important one too. So that's four. A fifth one you mentioned in passing, but I'd like to actually open this up a little bit, is and we were talking about where in the organization, and you said pragmatically it doesn't matter so much as long as you are strategic and you give it some deliberate thought. And then afterwards you said, this is where I think the other secret is, that you weave the volunteer dynamics or elements of experience in through all the planning that you do in your organization. Can you talk a bit more about that? And I know you mean strategic planning and planning campaigns and planning program developments and working through your grant strategies. You need to think of volunteers in all of them, and not just this idea that they're free, obviously.
Yeah, it's a foundational strategic idea that ideally is woven throughout the agency. And the reason that is not only because every interaction with a volunteer, with another volunteer, with a staff member, with a regular vendor, a driver, all of that is going to impact the community that you're in and that you're serving. And having a volunteer services or volunteer engagement, community engagement strategy at every level, from boots on the ground to the highest 20-year strategic master plan of any agency, it is essential. It's like not having your house bolted to your foundation. It's so fundamental, and it feels like it should be obvious, but it just isn't. And again, I think it's just because of these incorrect assumptions over decades and years that volunteers are free, or it doesn't cost anything, or it doesn't take any skill to run a program or to do volunteer engagement. There's no real strategy to it. But I think about it as kind of the three C's of happy volunteers are really the three C's of a good work environment or good team, which is that you're always considering, and this is part of what can be woven through the agency, is what is everyone's comfort, convenience, and connection to the work and to the mission. And comfort or happy volunteer, happy team doesn't mean that it's all puppies and rainbows all the time. It means that when the going gets tough, that people trust each other, they have that connection to each other, they feel comfortable in their training, their task, and in the role that they're assigned. They don't feel overwhelmed or under-resourced. And convenience ties into taking away those barriers. So the biggest barriers to people volunteering are really economic. It's time and money. So how much time and how much money does it cost me to go do this thing with your agency? So when you think about that strategically, not only does that benefit the volunteers, it benefits the employees, it benefits any sort of and boosts any kind of community and outreach or engagement with development, with education departments, if you're offering services to the community. All of this thinking that way about people's comfort, convenience, and connection to the mission helps really boost the brand awareness, to use the corporate term, of that agency. So having a fundamental idea of how volunteer and community engagement works with your mission, supports your mission, is really crucial at every planning stage, or planning your week out, or again, ideally, it's written in at, in the bylaws and at the core level, and it's a piece of everyone's training with the agency, is that messaging around volunteering.
Yeah, that's interesting, this idea that every training, because it almost goes back to the pragmatism about where volunteering sits. Yeah. And in a sense, it sits everywhere.
Yep, it does.
Everyone who's got decision-making authority, or who's going to manage some staff or manage some sort of initiative, really has to be thinking about the role of volunteers. And when I was just thinking about it, it's not, again, just specifying what they do and all that. It's all that investment that we talked about as that one secret, being really clear about what that effort's going to be. Otherwise, you're sort of undermining one of the most valuable resources that any nonprofit can have.
Yeah. And I think our sixth secret, maybe we can get to seven. Seven's a good number, but at least our sixth,
a good number,
possibly sixth or seventh secret that we're revealing today, is that it's everyone's job to engage volunteers. It's everybody's job in the agency, from the celebrity mega donor that pops in to host an event once a year, to, again, the entry-level volunteer coordinator, and then their manager, and then the director of volunteer services. So another common misconception or not helpful assumption that's made leading organizations is that, well, if we have a volunteer coordinator, that's all we need, and only that person handles the 300 people versus our 30 paid employees. It's like, no, it's actually like all 31 people are volunteer coordinators. One person supervise, one or two or five people, or however many in that department, run the program day to day, supervise it, make strategic decisions, ideally along with the rest of leadership team, executive committee. But it's everybody's job to do volunteer engagement, and we owe it to all employees and other volunteers that they know how to do that well, that they get some basic orientation and training in that crucial part, that crucial resource, and community engagement and connection and relationship building and creating advocates out in the community. All of that ties into, I've done these trainings, these messaging trainings, in 10 or 15 minutes. It can be an online e-learning video that's like, here's the messaging, here's who you talk to if you want more details about the volunteer program, or even if you answer the phone and someone asks about volunteering, here's who you point them to. Even questions like that can make the difference between someone feeling welcome or unwelcome, or taking down a barrier to them working as a volunteer with your organization.
It's every employee's part of the volunteer experience.
Everyone, yeah. And other volunteers are too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that with job titling and organizational dynamics, it's like health and safety, or quality, or or I mean, everyone's using technology, but the IT person, to the extent that there is one, is looking after the infrastructure. The quality person is looking after the reporting, perhaps, or some of the compliance issues. But it's the frontline staff who are really the quality team, because that's
Yep.
where it's actually happening. So it is easy to fall into that trap. If there's someone with that job title, I don't need to think about it anymore.
And it's really important. I'm going to jump on the IT crowd point for a minute, because and back to our technology point, so much of the technology that we're using, it's called VMS, volunteer management software, and there's a lot of great different companies around the world that provide this
Mm-hmm.
kind of service. But there's a whole subsector of technologies and apps and platforms that are specifically for volunteer engagement or managing or scheduling people and stuff like that. And database, it's really database management or CRM management, client
Yeah.
relationship management. And the IT guy is right there in it.
Yep.
So if
Yep.
if the director of volunteers doesn't have a really great relationship with IT, then that's going to cause problems on a very technical end with database management and internet security and privacy and confidentiality. Just like it's my job to not click on a phishing scam with a Nigerian prince offer of a lifetime in my company, and not let things through the firewall or not open back doors to viruses. It's everyone else's responsibility, in whatever their job title is, employee, again, other volunteers or vendors, to understand that they're a piece of that volunteer engagement, which is ultimately engaging with the whole community, because everyone's a potential something. Everyone's a potential volunteer or a potential donor or a potential board member or a potential future employee, staff leader of that organization, or a potential voting advocate. There's a lot of local and state and federal laws that get passed that really, really directly impact the sector and nonprofit services and community services and the social safety net. So it's, again, that kind of that fan of, you're a little bit of something all the time, and that holistic approach to thinking about volunteers and volunteerism and how it's a resource for the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and one other way I'm thinking of as a resource, can you comment a little bit about the idea of giving? And we talked about the sort of everyone is part of the volunteer experience. You said including
Mm-hmm.
volunteers, and so should be able to describe what volunteering means, or at least some easily accessible volunteering opportunities, and point you to the web page or the form or the person who can
Right.
who can do that. But volunteers should be able to do that too, right? I mean, should
Mm-hmm.
volunteers have at least the 5-second or 15-second version of the elevator pitch for the organization or the program, so that
Yep.
they too can be advocates for the organization?
Absolutely. I'm a huge believer, and I design this into whenever I'm doing a program update or evaluation or redesign for clients, is everyone gets messaging training. Absolutely everyone. And usually development and marketing are delighted to have somebody else say that, say that.
Right,
Um,
right,
and
right.
and have the organization go along, because, again, every interaction is important. Every single moment or second can make the difference between someone engaging with your work for whether it's 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 months, 5 weeks, 50 years, whatever that amount of time that someone's going to devote to working. And some people, they're lifers. They devote 40 or 50 years, and it's a huge part of their identity, and it's a huge emotional connection and a piece of their life purpose to be a volunteer and a board member and a donor, supporting organizations. That idea that everyone is the messenger and everyone should have that very basic agency and volunteering messaging training. Again, it doesn't have to take very long at all. Designing how to do the message might take a few hours to a few weeks, depending on what your mission is. But the hard part is just distilling it down to what is that 15 or 30-second version. And then who do you point to have a deeper conversation about,
Yeah,
again,
yeah. Which volunteers? Yeah.
donating, volunteer, but everyone, the someone doing meal delivery is seeing clients every day and having relationships with them and noticing when they are, not doing well, or someone with Project Open Hand, we often had volunteers walking with carts to the neighborhood delivering meals, and they could report medical incidents. And so that community connection can be life and death for a lot of people, and understanding the value of those connections, and that people know what to do, not just in messaging, but if you're doing any other kind of emergency response training or incident report training, like, make sure that the volunteers are getting at least the same level of training as any employees around not just messaging and the fun, happy stuff, but how to respond when bad stuff happens, how to respond to harassment, all of that. Having that training be really consistent for those topics for paid or unpaid people is absolutely crucial. Risk management, risk mitigation,
Yeah.
and also helps with that comfort, convenience, connection, that sense of we do trust each other because we share this knowledge, and we each are comfortable in our roles, even if it's doing difficult work, like emotionally difficult work with at-risk populations or animal welfare, or things that can be really, really draining. But we're there for each other, and we know what to do if something happens, good or bad. We know what the answer is, and who to go to for support. So
It
important.
seems a lot of as we draw to a close,
Yeah.
as I anticipated, we've galloped through our time today, and anyway, and I think we covered a lot of ground, because unless you're going to tell me that there's something glaring that we missed out, I think we might have even got up to 8. I'd have to go back and listen to the transcript and count them all out, but we've got at least a good half dozen. One of the, just I think in conclusion, that really a lot of these spill out from a clear mindset of what potential value volunteers bring. Yep. So it's that those 2 lessons around, one, they're not free. Understand what the investment's going to be. And the sort of quick follow on from that's got to be, well, if we're going to invest, well, let's get the best out of this investment that we can. And you're quickly onto one of those second lessons, which is weave this idea of volunteering into everything that you're planning and doing, and so on. And then a lot of the other things sort of spill out, I think, from there in order to do them well. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's a really great summary, because I think the big secret to success in a volunteer program is it's never just one thing. It's never just we need to recruit more, or why don't we retain people. That's always a surface symptom of needing to go deeper and have that deeper engagement with the volunteers and the paid employees that you already have, and figure out what people think about volunteers and volunteering. A lot of organizations never ask that of themselves. But that's a really good distillation that, it's a holistic approach. It really is a deep dive and a foundational part of the work that you're doing. And it deserves, again, the time and the investment and the thought going into it to be very intentional instead of, accidental.
Yes.
And a lot of times volunteer programs just kind of grow like weeds in a garden, and no one's really sure how something started or why it's there, but we've just been doing it that way forever. It's like, no, let's stop and take a look, and see how we can make our community and volunteer engagement meaningful and really intentional for all involved.
Yeah, intention goes a long way, to be sure. Thanks so much, Dana. Can you remind everyone where to find you online in case they want to get in touch with you?
Of course, Kev, DanaLitwinConsulting.com, YouTube channel, Dana's Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers. You can @ me on Twitter, Dana Litwin CVA. Find me on, is anyone still on Facebook? I don't know. I am. You can find me there.
And you're on LinkedIn.
And I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, all the usuals. I'm sort of on Instagram. I'm not on Snapchat. Sorry, everybody. I'm not on Snap. But yeah, you can find me again, Dana Litwin Consulting. Pretty easy to look me up. And thanks, Kev. It's always great to talk to you. I love doing these shows with you. It's really fun.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. That's been episode 45 with Dana Litwin on the secret to successful volunteer programs. And I'm sure we I'm sure we have 6, 7, or 8. I don't know. He said, well, where you draw the boundaries. Next time on episode 45, I'm with another alumni of season 1 when we ran panels. Is Tammy Charles, who's going to talk to us about building corporate partnerships. So I hope you tune in for that one. For today, though, that's the end, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.